whatever happens from here on, there will now always be the claim that when it came to saving people's lives, the UK was leagues ahead of the European Union.
Hello, I'm Muroki and welcome to Society Uncensored, a show on The Sun where I'll be discussing the day's hot issues with political and cultural guests. Today's guest is Matt Goodwin, Professor Matt Goodwin, who is Professor of Politics at the University of Kent and is also the Director of the Centre for UK Prosperity, which looks into kind of levelling up and how the UK can be more prosperous. So thank you so much, Professor Matt Goodwin, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And you've looked into a range of issues as an academic, and amongst those has been Euroscepticism. And I'm sure you would have been watching very keenly what's been going on with the EU and the vaccine row. Currently, the EU is holding its summit. And, off the back of that, I'm sure we'll be clearer on where exactly they are at the moment in terms of kind of the export ban. What have you made of all of this as somebody who's studied populism, studied nationalism in the EU? What have you made of this kind of vaccine route and the export ban that the EU have been touting?
Well, I think if we step back from the immediate row, what's clear is that the European Union has handled the vaccine episode incredibly poorly. This was the first big test for both the European Union and the United Kingdom after Brexit. It was the first real opportunity to benchmark the two powers against one another. And at the time of Brexit, we might forget, but at the time of Brexit, the real assumption was that the UK would gradually fall behind the European Union on most major tests that followed Brexit, on its economic performance, on its ability to manage various crises, and that over time the UK would change its mind and petition to rejoin the European Union. What we've seen during the vaccine episode is something very different, which is the United Kingdom outperforming the European Union and the UK state proving to be more flexible, more efficient, more effective, and becoming essentially a global leader in the design, development and delivery of effective vaccines. And I do think it is somewhat remarkable that within the space of a year of the first cases being identified in the UK, we have already now vaccinated more than half of our adult population. This is a seismic moment in the history, I think, of not only our country, but humankind more generally. I think this is an incredible moment for innovation. And the European Union, in contrast, has struggled. And I think it's been open at finally acknowledging how it struggled. It's been too cumbersome. It's been inefficient. There's not been sufficient accountability. And one of the ironies, of course, that has run through all of this is that many of the people who claim to be the most open and tolerant in the world have actually made some decisions that I think undermine that claim entirely, and have been in some respects much more protectionist than perhaps even their most passionate supporters would accept. So if you look at the polls today, about 60% of people in Britain say that the UK has outperformed the EU. And I personally do think this is a game changer. I think this is a real game changer in terms of our entire narrative for the rest of the 2020s, because whatever happens from here on, whatever happens with regard to the UK and the EU and how they perform in different areas, there will now always be the claim, and the justified claim, that when it came to saving people's lives and delivering these vaccines and distributing them, the UK was leagues ahead of the European Union. And that ultimately would be the reality going forward.
Yeah, that's completely right. And I think there'll be so many people watching what's going on and feeling, thank God we voted to leave the European Union. And I wonder how have you seen kind of sentiments around Brexit changed based on what's going on. I've seen a couple of polls showing that there are a big group of people who think that, particularly Brexiteers, who think that it's going better than expected, and even bigger group thinking it's going just as it was expected. And there are some Remainers as well saying that Brexit is going much better than they expected. So how are we seeing kind of the changes in public opinion around the EU? And do you think this will be a long-term change, or perhaps is this really just directly reflecting what's going on at the moment with vaccines?
Well, at a very broad level, we've not seen Leavers and Remainers fundamentally change their minds over Brexit. Leavers think it's great, it's the right decision. Remainers tend to think it was a bad decision, and on balance, they tend to think it's not going very well. But as you say, within the Remain camp, there is a significant number of Remainers who are openly admitting that actually Brexit is going a little bit better than they had expected. And for Leavers, a significant number say that even within the context of their decision to vote for this new path for the country, it's going better than they expected. And I think one of the reasons, why people haven't changed their minds over Brexit, and one of the reasons why Leavers have remained so committed to this project, is because even still today, we fundamentally misdiagnose why people voted for it in the first place. And we're told over and over again that disruption on the border, that slightly more expensive food items, that a little bit of economic disruption is fundamentally going to change the dial, is really going to impact on how people see this project. But all of the research, I would argue, all of the studies that we have, all show the same thing, which is that for people who voted for Brexit, this wasn't actually about what was in their wallets. It wasn't about what was in their pockets. It wasn't about their bank accounts. It was about their desire to have much greater control and influence over the decisions that affect their daily lives and over the institutions that affect their daily lives. And this was ultimately a vote that was also what we would call sociotropic. It was about all of the people in the country. They weren't just going into the polling stations and thinking about themselves and thinking about their economic interests. They were thinking about what's good for the country, what's good for the British people. And ever since that moment, I think much of our commentary about Brexit has really been out of sync with the reality of why people voted for it in the first place. And if you look at the vaccine dispute at the moment, and you look at the current COVID crisis, I think for many Leavers, this really reinforces a belief they already had before the referendum in 2016. If you go all the way back to the 1970s, the reason why the UK voted to join the European community was primarily at that point in time about the economy, that we were the sick man of Europe. We were essentially becoming a failed state. We were almost an ungovernable country. Ted Heath, of course, asking the country who governs, because we weren't entirely sure who did govern, because there was so much chaos and disruption. But since then, actually the reverse has happened. The UK has increasingly been outperforming the European Union, and the European Union has been struggling to resolve a number of big crises. The sovereign debt crisis from 2008, the refugee crisis from 2014, and now the vaccine crisis from 2020. And I think for Leavers, this is yet more evidence that actually the European Union is really not an effective and efficient organization, and they'd rather invest in the UK as a more nimble, independent and fast-moving state.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that people voted Brexit, which is kind of complicated, it ended up in a complicated debate and a complicated national discourse, was this issue of immigration, particularly because, as you'll be very aware, it was tied up with issues of kind of xenophobia and racism. Accusations were thrown around. Now that we've come out of the EU, we've obviously seen the government implement this point-based immigration system, and we've seen policies coming out this week from Priti Patel on curbing kind of illegal immigration and reforms around how asylum seekers can claim for asylum. Do you think a lot of Brexiteers will kind of feel vindicated, and how are these policies that are coming out going to be perceived by the country? This will we be kind of go back to being accused of having these anti-immigrant sentiments, or actually will the country be looking at this saying, this is a great thing, the government are actually listening to us for why we voted to leave the European Union?
Well, public anxieties over immigration were absolutely central to the Brexit vote. But one of the big myths about that vote was that it was driven by xenophobia and racism. I'm somebody who believes in evidence, not just simply relying on people's lived experiences. I'm somebody who tries to look at the data and what it is telling us about what is really going on in the country. And if you look at the most reliable surveys that we have, we can see quite clearly that levels of racism and prejudice in the UK have been at their lowest levels in our recorded history over recent years. And if you look at the effect of the Brexit vote, what you can see in the aftermath of the referendum is that public opinion becomes even more positive towards issues around migration and diversity. People become much more relaxed about the issue because they feel that they have control over that issue. And much of the rhetoric since the referendum, I think, has really tried to portray Brexiteers in a particular light. And that is for obvious reasons. One of the goals has been to delegitimize the vote for Brexit and to portray it as being anchored in prejudice and racism. And there certainly are people who have racist views in British society. But the majority of Leavers, including, by the way, the 1 in 3 Black and minority ethnic Leavers, firmly disassociate themselves from those views. And I think that we generally have lost perspective actually on questions around race and race relations in the UK. And we can debate about why that is and the ideologies that are contributing to that. But I think we're in a much better place on the question of immigration than we were before the referendum. If you look at how people think about immigration policy, the British were always pragmatic. They were very supportive of high-skilled migration, international students. They were supportive of migration that contributes to public services, but they were very anxious about what they saw as uncontrollable, low-skilled and continuously high rates of migration that they had no control over. And as a consequence, they took the decision that they did in 2016. And my personal view is that actually, on the question of migration, our society is stronger as a result of that. If you look at how Brits think about Hong Kongers, for example, arriving, they're very relaxed about Hong Kongers coming over. They see the case for it. They feel that they have control over this policy area. And unfortunately, between 2004 and the referendum, our political leaders simply lost touch with the country on that issue. They implemented policies where there were no transitional controls. They subjected the British people to essentially an experiment that was not really given to anybody else in the European Union at that particular time. And New Labour really set that train in motion, and the collapse of the Red Wall, the collapse of the Labour Party, the collapse of the Labour Party's relationship with the working class, I think can be traced back to the decisions that were taken by New Labour over the migration issue.
You talk about a lot about kind of politicians and the elite kind of being out of touch and losing touch with ordinary people and disaffected communities. Are our institutions, and of course I'm going to be talking about academia with you since you're right in the middle of it. But are our institutions more generally kind of becoming too woke, too out of touch, too middle class, too metropolitan? And is this something that you think is going to get worse or better? We've got a kind of GB News, for example, coming out as a direct reaction to that a channel that's going to kind of cater to people who feel that the media is too woke, people who feel disaffected. Where do you see the country going in terms of, how our media institutions, political institutions, and academic institutions, how they reflect the views of broader society, which we know tend to be conservative? How do you think our media is dealing with that, our media and our institutions?
Well, I'm a big believer in the idea of voice, that everybody in society should have a voice in the conversation. And over the last 20 years, it has become abundantly clear that we have a society that simply values some voices far more than others. And if we take a long-term view, I would argue that over the last 3 or 4 decades, large groups in British society, groups that used to dominate British society, working class voters, people without university degrees, people who hold small c conservative values, have essentially been written out of a number of very big and influential institutions in British society, including the institutions that used to give those groups voice. The Labour Party has turned inwards, has become a much more middle-class party for university graduates. Trade unions have completely collapsed and have increasingly reorientated themselves around white-collar rather than blue-collar voters. Large parts of our media have increasingly been filled with university degree holders from elite universities that often come from very privileged families. And I think more generally, if you look across British culture, personally, I don't think we talk enough about culture and how it relates to politics, but if you look across film, television, the arts, publishing, who wins Oscars, who gets to go to Oxbridge, across all of those areas, while there has been a little bit of improvement in some of them in the last few years, they are still essentially hardwired against the very same groups who have been pushing through these rebellions in British politics. I mean, put it this way, it is no coincidence that the groups that powered the rise of Nigel Farage, and then the vote for Brexit, and then the realignment of politics and the collapse of the Red Wall, are the very same groups who, I would argue, have been consistently, some might say systematically, excluded from our national conversation. And I think that one of the silver linings that has come through Brexit, and why, unlike many of my colleagues, I was very open to the idea of Brexit, very accepting of the referendum result, is that it gives us an opportunity to revisit that discussion about voice. Who has a voice in our society and who doesn't? Which institutions should we be moving to other parts of the country? How should we reshape our media landscape, as you mentioned, Mercy, with GB News and other institutions that are trying to cater more successfully to those other voices? How should we open up our universities to people from very different backgrounds? And why is it, for example, that many of the groups that have been so unhappy with politics have also actually been the worst performers within our primary and secondary school education system? We've got this whole new conversation over race and white privilege and all of this kind of stuff. But the blunt reality, when you look at the data, is the kids who have been doing the worst across a large chunk of our education system are white working class kids who we've just sort of cut adrift and said, well, we're not really that interested in this group. Now, if we were talking about any other group in British society, there would be a national outrage and we would have celebrities and others falling over themselves to create hashtags and awards and special scholarships and so on and so forth. We don't have that because, let's be honest, some groups are just simply not fashionable. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the last decade has delivered the political rebellions that it has, because our settlement, our society, has been failing to give those groups a voice and has been failing to give them respect, to be blunt. And as a consequence, we are now living in this new era.
As you say, the race debate has very much been front and center recently, and it has very much become about kind of lived experience and, subjective experience. And going back to this point about data, it is true that We do see that white kids, particularly poor white kids on free school meals, are the worst performing, least likely to get into university. And a lot of people don't actually realise that there are a lot of ethnic minority groups are actually doing much better in terms of, particular outcomes than the white group. But it's almost like you can't talk about the data if it relates to poor white people without being called a racist, or without somebody saying you're denying racism. Do you think the fact that we're almost, some people say we're always banging on about race these days, do you think we're at risk of actually forgetting these people again in this debate? Forgetting that actually these are some of these communities are the poorest, most disaffected. Is the national conversation conducive at all to talking about that group, talking about the facts that these people are disaffected too and need to be heard?
Well, my reading on this is over the last half century or so, almost all of the collective institutions that used to hold different groups in society together have been hollowed out, have been weakened, and in some cases have been dismantled. And some of that was for good reasons, some of it perhaps I would argue was for bad reasons. But if you go back half a century and you think about the things that used to hold the British people together, a religion, strong families, a representative politics, those have all in some form or another been weakened and hollowed out. And fast forward to today, into this vacuum that we're sort of living in, and I think it's only natural that new narratives have entered into that vacuum. And unfortunately, I would argue for many of us, one of those narratives has been incredibly destructive and divisive, and basically paints society as being divided between only two groups. There are the good groups, the bad groups. There are the privileged groups and the oppressed groups. And it is a narrative that really doesn't actually have that much interest in individuals. It merely aligns individuals to their racial and ethnic groups. And I would argue, at least, it takes us back to a conversation that I think many civil rights campaigners thought was over, a conversation that basically views society simply through the prism of different racial and ethnic groups competing with one another over power. So what we've lost are the broad unifying narratives that we used to have. I mean, we used to talk about things like citizenship. We used to have both the left and right of British politics talking about national identity, talking about big collective unifying projects, building the welfare state, building the National Health Service, being good citizens, having obligations to one another. And those broader narratives, I would argue, have given way to this much more destructive narrative. So if you are in the white working class, or you're one of these kids that we've been looking at through the Education Committee recently, the inquiry on left behind children, you're not in the right group. You're at the bottom of the hierarchy, particularly if you're white and you're working class and you're male especially, you're basically the least fashionable member of society. And that took a new turn after Brexit, because then those groups were simultaneously portrayed as being racist, backward, fascist, etc., etc. So all of a sudden they had a sort of new layer of stigmatization put on top of them. And I'm worried that that's really having quite disastrous consequences, because we're now really stripping away people's sense of agency, their sense that they can change their lives for the better. And that is also true of our minority communities. As you say, Mercy, our debate over race is so incredibly simplistic that it completely ignores actual data on what's happening in terms of people's attitudes toward other racial groups. And I think the long-term story is incredibly positive. We've become far more tolerant and open and welcoming than we were in the 1960s, 1970s, or 1980s. And the data shows that quite clearly. But it also ignores the remarkable progress that many minority groups have made within the education system, but also a rising middle class, across a whole section of our society, we have minority ethnic groups doing much, much better than they were previously. But the progress story is written out because the narrative isn't really interested in progress. The narrative is essentially interested in deconstructing institutions and deconstructing our ability to unify around a common project. And so, unfortunately, we've entered into this situation where we are seemingly unable to provide the country with a new, broad, unifying story about who we are. And until we can get back to that, I'm afraid these more destructive narratives are going to be given free rein, and they're not going to have really any competition, which is very unfortunate.
You talk about having a national conversation, about who we are as a country, trying to find some sense of unity. And part of that very much entails free speech and people being able to freely express what they think. And there'll be so many people watching who think, everything you're saying is, almost common sense. And yet we know from the last few years, people who have your kinds of views, they've been cancelled. And this has actually almost kind of been coming from academia, and academics have not been afraid to kind of cancel people for having what are actually just the views of regular people on the ground. As an academic yourself, I mean, what has been your experience of this, your experience of cancel culture and censorship?
I think it's fair to say that anybody who engages with me on social media or Twitter has probably seen what my experience has been like over the last few years. I would divide my career into pre-Brexit and post-Brexit, and I was part of the 10% of UK academia that essentially welcomed Brexit, supported Brexit, and saying the referendum result is here. Let's respect it. Let's implement it. Let's work with it. I didn't campaign for Brexit. I wouldn't have described myself as a Brexiteer, but I was certainly open to the possibility that a large number of people felt that the existing settlement simply was not working for them, and that we had a country that had been reshaped around the interests, the values, and the lifestyles of middle-class graduates. And as a consequence, I was open for various reasons, given my background growing up in a working class community and so on, that I was much more open to it than some of my colleagues. And then I went on a bit of a journey, just more generally, with a number of other concerned academics to explore whether our universities are really as open and tolerant as they claim to be. And I think the first key point to make here is that the vast majority of academics do not support cancel culture and do not support their colleagues being disinvited, sacked, and dismissed. That's the first key point. But the second point is that many academics, because our institutions are so ideologically homogenous, we've got about between 75 and 85% of academics voting for socially liberal, left-wing, progressive parties. And because of that skew, because it's become much stronger since the 1960s, it's not true when people say it was always this way. It's not accurate. We've seen a really quite sharp swing over the last 40 years, as has America. And because of that, many moderate, sensible, common sense people feel they cannot speak up because the social norms within higher education work against that. So they feel that if a colleague is being harassed, bullied, intimidated, disinvited, discriminated against because of their ideological or political views, it's not fashionable and it's not good for your career to speak out. And that also applies, by the way, to early career academics who essentially have to play the game in order to rise up the ladder. And I think this becomes problematic as well when you start to see the evidence that we can see. We've had a number of recent reports recently from a number of different organizations, Civitas, Policy Exchange, to name only a few. I've looked at a lot of the data, understanding society data, and it all, I would argue, tells a fairly coherent story which is that we have a worryingly large number of students and academics self-censoring. In other words, hiding their real views because they don't feel that they can voice those views within higher education. If you look at a recent report by King's College London, for example, that estimates that about 1/4 of all students in the UK are self-censoring in seminars and lectures because they're worried about the consequences of sharing their views and what that will entail in terms of their friends perhaps giving them a hard time on social media. But we've also got a large number of conservative academics, gender critical academics who question, for example, some of the recent legislation on gender issues, or historians who adopt a more nuanced position on questions like Britain's empire and other episodes in our national history, who perhaps don't want to say actually everything is fundamentally negative. They might have a nuanced view. Those groups in particular have had a very difficult time, and the prominent cases obviously being the ones that we've all heard about: Jordan Peterson being disinvited from Cambridge, Noah Carl being sacked from Cambridge, gender critical scholars Kathleen Stock, Selena Todd. I could go on. I've counted about 24 cases so far of people being disinvited or harassed. And so I'm actually very supportive of the Conservative government's moves in this area to establish what they're calling an academic free speech champion, because I reached the depressing conclusion that I don't think higher education can actually be left on its own to deal with this issue, because so far it has actually proven unable to deal with this issue. I don't want any students in the UK self-censoring, and I don't want any students in the UK to be going to universities and not being given the full range of perspectives and opinions and beliefs that they are going to encounter the moment they leave university campus. We need to protect and promote viewpoint diversity within our universities much more aggressively, I think, than we're doing at the moment, because ultimately this is about the polarization of our society. If you genuinely want to bring people together, we're going to have to do a much better job in terms of how we train and educate the next generation.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I know from my own experience of spending most of my adult life on university campuses that there is a lot of censorship going on. And, you know, it's happened to me when I've expressed kind of conservative values in academia, and it's such a problem. And as you say, it's great that the government have kind of taken action on it. Matt, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks for having me.